Hello, everybody. We've emailed Dr. Chabib some of the questions that you've provided us, and hopefully he'll be able to email back some questions and some answers, and I can provide those to you. Just looking through the questions for Dr. Hildebrand. One question was, Dr. Hildebrand, using the major available renal genetic testing panels, what are the most common few missing genes in these panels? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because I would have to go through those one by one. Most of them are pretty comprehensive by now. So yeah, this is pretty much all I can say from here, unfortunately, because it's kind of depending on which company you use. But you can compare the gene lists for each of the different panels, and if there's a differential diagnostic criterion to suspect that a disease gene that's not on there that causes a syndromic phenotype, then you might want to go with a panel that contains that, or run the panel and then following genetic counseling see whether it's worthwhile due to the specific association of symptoms, syndromic symptoms, to do a single gene evaluation in a gene that you're suspecting.
Can you, we'll hear from also Dr. Anuchik Whitford about this, but the problem is you'll get a VUS from your Renocyte panel that looks tempting, but we don't really know the biology for a given gene, even with the predictors that exist, sort of the informatics predictors. When you say evaluate, when we get this kind of genetic output, how would you advise us to deal with it?
Yeah, that's definitely very, very important question. Everything circles around VUSs. And my personal approach is a variant of unknown significance pretty much means that none of the criteria, the very stringent criteria that implicated functionally in disease causing, I would always interpret that in a way as that genetic diagnostics did not contribute at all to the question whether this gene is disease causing. So in other words, it's very tempting, as you said, to always think, oh, this makes sense. But in a scientific approach, if a company or a lab declares something as a VUS, then I would not counsel the patient in a way that there could be something. I would rather say nothing was found. That's very, very important, because otherwise you leave the patient with the expectation that maybe at some point there may be something, or there's a percentage of a risk that this could be causative. I would rather counsel in the way of all or nothing. If there's a deleterious variant that's published or where there's functional data found, then this can be counseled as causative. But if it's a VUS, I would pretty much counsel the patient as we have no answer.
Oh, really? That's interesting to hear. Yeah, and one of the other issues that came up recently, what a company considers a VUS or a quote causative mutation gets tricky. So the M1 variant in APOL1, which is found in G2 alleles, and it's a point mutation that is described as reducing the channel activity, and pretty clearly in a JAMA paper from March, seems to sort of negate the effect of G2 alleles. So it's almost like it's a negative gene or a protective mutation. They're not reporting it in the Renocyte panel as of yet. We sort of prodded several companies, and you won't find that out from your Natera screen. So which was odd that they wouldn't report it as a VUS if they were saying, well, we don't know what it is. but why isn't it just in your VUS bin? So it gets complicated.
Right. Yeah. So a false negative is much less dangerous, so to speak, than a false positive, because if there's the insinuation to the patient that this could be causative, in a dominant disease, this knowledge may spread through the entire pedigree, and certain individuals who are more careful may act on something that is really not causative. So I would be very conservative, because we've seen this when in our gene discovery, we had very stringent criteria before we decided that and to go ahead with functional studies and publish a novel gene. And then in observing the diagnostic literature after that, there's this drag and drift towards insinuating to the patient that this could have something to do with the disease causation, but often with weak, potentially weak pathogenic variants, which stay at the level of VUS. Those were the ones that always went away when we had multiple alternatives in discovering new genes. So I would be really arguing from the side of caution there.
That's good to hear. All right. And the other question I had is, why is HNF1 beta the sort of syphilis great imitator of renal genetics? It causes so many different, seemingly varied phenotypes. Is it just where in the gene the mutation is, or is there a good phenotypic variation or correlation? Or
a very interesting question. I think it's, excuse me, because it's also a molecular chameleon, because it's a transcription factor. So by definition, it is at the heart of the pathogenesis of any CACUT or renal malformations. That's part of the phenotype, but also very prominently, and Peter Agarashi has shown this 30 years ago, it is a transcription factor that modulates many renal cystic disease genes, including UMOD, PKD1, PKD2, ARPKD. So it has a dual pathogenesis in a way. And then in a dose-related way and in a stochastic, time-dependent way, it may segue into more the renal cystic pathogenesis or more into the developmental CACUT pathogenesis.
No, it's and we had a clinical case that was discussed at our renal grand rounds, and it was, I can't remember what renal phenotype the patient had, but she had a deletion in HNF1 beta, and she had a bit of a sort of autism spectrum disorder as well that was attributed to it. And it was interesting because she was the most relieved to have an explanation as to why she was on the spectrum. And it wasn't so much the renal phenotype that she was relieved to hear about. It was like, oh, that explains it. I'm just a bit off.
That can definitely be a relief for certain kinds of symptoms to the patients.
All right, so thank you. That was terrific talk. We have some questions for Dr. Shabib that he was able to answer by email. One was, could you comment on the use of SGLT2I for these patients with cystic disease and type 2 diabetes? And he said KDIGO only recommends SGLT2I and ADPKD when there is heart failure, not indicated when there is diabetes mellitus, diabetes and ADPKD until we get more evidence. But in my opinion, it could be used with careful monitoring. And then the next question is, to what EGFR is it appropriate to continue tolvaptan for ADPKD? And he replied, continue tolvaptan until the need for replacement therapy, whether dialysis or preemptive kidney transplant. So like many of these other sort of organ-preserving drugs, continue until the bitter end. Then there were some residual questions for me. One was, in a patient on atrasentan, RAS, finerenone, and SGLT2I. I would assume if the patient's on finerenone, there's some degree of diabetes. With low GFR 28 to 30, would you recommend adding on budesonide or MMF in a patient with UPCR of 0.7? And I think this illustrates the dilemma with IgA nephropathy. If you have somebody who's had a prior diagnosis on biopsy and did not get prednisone therapy based on prior recommendations. How do you deal with that patient? Do you put them on Tarpeo or prednisone plus minus MMF? And I think it's an individualized question to talk to the patient about. My sense is that the APRIL-BAFF inhibitors are a lot more benign than steroid. So I might recommend that they go on that rather than a steroid therapy. It would be terrific if we could monitor galactose deficient IgA1. I don't know how or when that'll get validated. But so I think it's an individualized question. The other one was, how do we know if Entocort will provide the same reduction in, do we know if Entocort will provide the same reduction in galactose deficient IgA as Nefecon/Tarpeo? The answer is probably not. Nefecon's a different budesonide tolerated tapered drug that is targeted for a different region of the GI tract than Nefecon/Tarpeo, which is more the terminal ileum. And I looked online. I didn't see any data on other budesonide drugs for IgA nephropathy. I have to say that generally, my experience has been that people do get Cushingoid effects from Tarpeo. It's not completely devoid of that. So that, and it's not been directly compared really to prednisone. So that's another question.